If caulking isn't one of those jobs where you think, gosh, this is super easy and totally worth it, you need to watch this video because I'm going to change all that for you. Caulking is easy and doesn't have to be messy. Let me show you 8 ways that you can make caulking super easy. Number 1, we can use painter's tape to get clean lines. Now this is less important when you're caulking along a baseboard, but when you're doing a window or a countertop or something like that where you've got a smooth surface that you're not going to paint, it's important that you get a nice clean line. Otherwise we kind of end up with some of this sort of smudginess because the caulk will attract dirt over time. And what we don't want is to end up with this really thin film of caulk that you get from just spreading it out. So by running a little bit of painter's tape along here, then we can place the caulk, we can spread it out, and then while it's still wet, we go ahead and peel the painter's tape off. You're gonna get a nice smooth edge and a nice clean line. The next thing is when we're going to caulk, when we cut off the tip, usually you're gonna wanna cut a really small hole and at a bit of an angle, maybe about 45 degrees. That's going to give you a lot more control. You're gonna get a lot less caulk pouring out at once. Usually when we're caulking, we don't want that much. In fact, when I'm caulking, oftentimes it's easy to do too much. Really, we just are putting some pretty gentle pressure on the handle and then holding it consistent as we slide the caulk gun along an edge. Having too big of a hole is just gonna get way too much caulk out. You can see the size of the hole here. It's not that big, and we cut it at an angle. Now, sometimes it's harder to use the little knife thing on the caulk gun and get it just on the tip at just the right angle. So if you have decent control, you can use a utility knife and usually get the edge just at the angle that you want. I still use the little knife on the caulk gun, but I've just found that sometimes if that's not very sharp, it can be easy to end up just kind of beating up the end of it instead of actually getting a nice clean cut. The next one is to warm up the caulk tube. Now you don't always need to do this, but especially if you're working in a somewhat cold environment, if the caulk is cold, it's gonna get really thick and it's not gonna come out very evenly. By just warming it up a little bit, you can get it to come out really nice and smooth. Now we wanna actually warm up like the whole caulk tube. And so the best way to do that is when you have an unopened tube, you can just put it in a sink or a bucket with warm water in it and just let it sit for a while. And that's gonna help warm it all the way through. The next tip is when we're actually doing the caulking, instead of pulling the caulk gun, you wanna push it away from you. So don't pull it toward you, push it away from you. It feels a little counterintuitive. I've always felt natural pulling the caulk gun, but when I learned to push instead of pull, I found I had substantially more control and I ended up with a much cleaner bead right off the bat. Way less over caulking and just a much smoother starting bead. And so there's just a lot less cleanup to do in the first place. Now the next tip is when it is time to clean it up, we want to do it first of all right away. And so we want to smooth out that caulk bead, especially any parts that aren't totally smooth already. And the easiest way I found to do this is with your finger. They make little rubber tools and stuff, and I found that those just build up a lot of caulk really fast on them unless you keep them really good and clean all the time. I don't know. To me, they just don't work better than my finger. In fact, my finger tends to work better. I just have more control. But you're gonna end up with a lot of caulk on your finger. And so what I do is I dip my finger into a cup with some warm water and just a little bit of dish soap. And that's gonna help make the caulk not stick to my finger. I've already done a bunch of caulking today and my finger's totally clean. Which brings me to my next point. I like to keep a rag handy, one where at least part of the rag is a little bit damp. What that allows me to do is to quickly clean up caulk right at the time while it's still wet, okay? So I've done the smoothing, but sometimes you end up with a little bit of smeared caulk or little chunks of caulk in places where you don't want them. Wiping that off now while it's still wet with a rag that you have on hand is really, really helpful. Plus, then the caulk that I do get on my finger from doing all the smoothing, even when my finger's wet, I get a little bit of caulk there, I can just quick wipe it off and it comes right off if I do it right away. So just keep a wet rag handy, or paper towel works just fine too. My next piece of advice is to use a dripless caulk gun or an anti-drip caulk gun. They don't cost much more than your cheapest caulk gun, but they make a huge difference. With a typical caulk gun, when you're done caulking, like when you take the pressure off, it's just gonna keep pouring out a bunch of caulk unless you quickly take the pressure off the back. With a dripless caulk gun, there's a mechanism inside so that when I let go of the trigger, it actually pulls back a little bit and takes the pressure off. And so only the little bit of built up pressure inside is gonna do any pushing, and you're gonna end up with just this little bit of drip maybe at the end right after you let go, and you're gonna get used to that. So you can just kind of let off just a second before you're actually done caulking, and you're gonna be just fine. But with a cheaper or an older caulk gun that doesn't have the anti-drip feature, you're just gonna end up getting so much more out unless you just really get in the habit of backing it off really quickly every time that you're done caulking a section. This last tip I learned from a countertop installer when he was doing granite countertops in our bathroom. And what he told us is that when he's doing, especially with stone, and I could see doing this maybe on a window as well, not so much, again, on surfaces that I'm going to paint, but on surfaces that I'm not. If you're using silicone caulk, which is typical in a bathroom kitchen setting where it's gonna get really wet, that silicone caulk, first of all, most silicone caulk doesn't paint very well anyway, but second of all, it has a tendency to leave like a film. So if you don't actually get all of it off, like on a granite countertop or a stone countertop, then anywhere where you just kind of smeared it, it's gonna leave this like film that later peels off, and then it leaves kind of a rough edge on the actual caulk. So what he taught us to do was you lay the caulk in, just like we talked about, pushing, right? So we don't end up with way too much. And then when he goes to smear it with his finger, instead of just getting his finger wet, which you could do as well, he actually spritzes that caulk joint with a little bit of Windex and then use a paper towel. And what that does is it helps make that caulk not stick to the surface of that countertop or the wall adjacent to the countertop. And so as you smooth it with a paper towel, you get a nice smooth caulk bead, but you also don't end up with that thin silicone caulk film that's later just gonna peel off. Incorporate these tips into your caulking and it's gonna make your caulking experience so much faster and cleaner and better. And then you're gonna find that you don't mind caulking so much, but also you're gonna find that on projects where maybe you would have skipped the caulking, but the caulking would have made it look a lot more finished, you're gonna decide it's totally worth it. I'm gonna do the caulking and finish out this project right. I hope that was helpful for you. If there's other things you'd like to learn here on Fixter, let me know in the comments below. And if you have other tips for caulking, share with all of us here in this community in the comments below. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in our next video.